are in, so we can get started. First of all, I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining this webinar, which is co-organized by the EFCTC and Ricardo Energy and Environment. This webinar is to give you a little bit of an overview of the EFCTC socio-economic assessment on the impact of the PFAS restriction on F-gases. We can go to the next slide. So I can highlight that this webinar will take place in full compliance with competition law. This means that no confidential information will be discussed today. As you can see, the webinar is being recorded. We plan on sharing upon request the recordings of the presentation. There will be a Q&A session later on. This will also be recorded, but the recordings will not be shared. It is simply for us to make sure that all the questions and answers are summarized in a document that we will then share with you. To this purpose, I would actually like to ask you to please write your questions in the chat. This will allow us to have access to the questions also after the meeting, and in case we didn't have time to address your question, we can do it after the meeting, and we can include it in the document, the Q&A document that we will share afterwards. Next slide, please. I think we can get started. My name is Elisa Consoli. I'm one of the managers of the European Fluorocarbons Technical Committee, which is a sector group of CEFIC, and it represents the 5 companies that you see on the screen. With me today presenting, I have Inge from Ricardo, and I can let the floor to Inge now, and she will give us a little bit of introduction about Ricardo and the socioeconomic assessment. Thank you. Inge, you are on mute, sorry.
Thanks, Elisa. And thanks everyone for coming. I'm Inge Kugla, I'm senior economist at Ricardo, and with me is David. David, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I'm David Birchby, an associate director economist at Ricardo.
Thanks, David.
Inge, we cannot hear you. I think you're on mute again.
Sorry.
No worries.
Just a short introduction for us as Ricardo. We are an energy and environment consultancy with over 40 years of experience working with clients across the globe. We employ more than 500 people, including many internationally renowned technical experts and consultants, and we form part of the Ricardo Group. We work internationally across 7 practice areas, supported by strong cross-functional teams specializing in data management, IT solutions, and economics. Our clients include central and local governments across the world, the European Commission, multinational corporations, and a wide range of public and private sector organizations. Our capability and expertise includes more than 150 experts working on today's global energy and climate challenges, 130 strong resource efficiency and waste management team that is at the forefront of efforts helping to conserve our global natural resources, air quality experts that are helping governments and businesses to protect our health and the environment. And we also provide 24-hour multilingual chemical risk management to over 500 companies worldwide. We also specialize in techno-economic and management consultancy services for the energy sector, with particular emphasis on the power sector. In the realm of chemicals policy, as you may be aware already, we are in the midst of analyzing the chemicals strategy for sustainability for CEFIC, about which they have already published the first part regarding the introduction of the general risk approach to risk management and the CLP. So for this study, this is a socioeconomic analysis of the value of F-gases, and we are about to run an economic consultation to know about the economic impacts of a potential restriction of F-gases in the European industry. So in this meeting, we are going to review the economic consultation aims and its needs, and how you can contribute to it via participation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the study context, a short recap about impact assessments and socioeconomic analysis, and then I'll go into more detail with the expected outputs from the study and what we're going to analyze with the consultation. I'm going to explain how we are going to establish a baseline, the economic impacts that we are going to consider from a potential restriction of F-gases, and a short introduction about how the online survey is going to work for you, and then the timeline of the study. So as you know, Ricardo has been commissioned by the EFCTC to undertake an independent socioeconomic analysis of the contribution of certain fluorinated gases, F-gases, to the economy and wider society. Some of these F-gases, which I'm going to refer to as F-gases in scope from now on, have been identified as key inputs to your businesses. Our socioeconomic analysis will be used to support a response to the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA, to their consultation on the new proposal to restrict PFAS that in their definition of PFAS includes some F-gases. The extent of this restriction is yet to be entirely defined and can still change along the consultation process. If restricted, and if you're here today, we understand that your business will most probably lose a key input, and alternatives to F-gases in scope would have to be used. We aim to find the extent of these losses and of possible alternatives to F-gases in scope with this consultation. And we aim to use that as supportive evidence of the value of F-gases in the socioeconomic analysis to be submitted to ECHA. So the objectives of these assessments are to provide an overview of the direct and attributable economic contribution of the F-gas industry with support from members from the EFCTC, to outline economic and societal benefits generated along the downstream value chain from the use of F-gases in various critical applications and sectors. And in this, your contribution and your production is one of such critical applications of F-gases. And to identify alternatives to F-gases in the scope of in various critical applications and their cost compared to the current situation with the use of F-gases, thanks to your contribution to this consultation. So in the broader context of this study, we are in the phase of consulting stakeholders in the green rectangle, and thanks to your contribution, we are going to be able to assess a measure of volume and sales that are going to be affected by this intended restriction of F-gases, and further impacts to the economy and society in the European Economic Area. So in the end, we're going to be able to assess the economic contribution of F-gases by use. Within the REACH restriction process, where are we now? So the intention to restrict was submitted by the end of last year. We are now in the process of, well, ECHA is now in the process of preparing us and submitting, of receiving the full restriction proposal. And during the second half of this year, there are going to be an open public consultation to which we are going to submit this study. Then in the following year, there will be some development of opinions using all the evidence collected, and the decision will follow in the following 2 years. So what are these socioeconomic assessments and more broadly impact assessments that are very usual in the policy evaluation? So this is an ex-ante assessment. The regulatory option to be developed is not yet fully defined. We only have a broad idea of how it's going to work. And by definition, as a conclusion, this assessment will rely on estimations, best guesses, and expert opinions based on available information. An ex-ante assessment differs from an ex-post assessment or an evaluation in which it's based on the collection of actual impact data after policy implementation, the evaluation. An ex-ante assessment can only use best guesses. So it's going to be based on evidence-based hypotheses. These assessments do not provide a definitive answer, as regulatory changes are yet to be defined and implemented. They form evidence-based hypotheses as to what may happen, And in this context, you as the industry members are what is considered experts in this field. So your input is going to be key to construct a strong evidence base that is rigorous and strong. And there are some data limitations, of course, that point towards the consultation being the best option in this case. Because given the nature of the proposed changes to the regulation and the lack of international precedent, the use of historical data or data published on the impact on other impact assessments has limits and can only tell us so much. So we cannot use evidence from this for example, this has been done in another country, and we use whatever happened there in order to infer what could happen in the European Economic Area. So we have to build an analysis and a model and form evidence to form our guesses. So as a consequence, your views and expertise will contribute to our ongoing work on the socioeconomic analysis report on the contribution of F-gases to the European Economic Area, EEA from here, economy and wider society. This study, as I said, is going to be submitted as a response to ECHA's public consultation on the possible restriction, and then it will form part of the evidence base that supports ECHA's committee's final opinion. So your input is going to be much appreciated. So what are the goals of this study? We aim to assess, ideally quantitatively, the core economic impacts in the form of costs and benefits of the intended REACH restriction of PFAS, specifically only in what affects the F-gases in scope, to develop an understanding of its overall economic impact of the European F-gas on the European F-gas industry, their downstream users, and the overall economy and society. So the scope of the assessment, even though it affects all PFAS, is going to be restricted to F-gases only. We are going to provide you a list of F-gases in scope that is shown here for reference, and any mixture containing these F-gases is going to be a part of the scope too. Geographically, this is going to be limited to the activities in the European Economic Area, which is formed by the European Union, EU27, plus Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. So, from a potential restriction on PFAS, there is going to be a regulatory burden on firms. The loss of an ingredient or an input to the production of many downstream users is going to imply the having to look for alternatives, having to change their production process. Potentially, there are a lot of strategies that the industry can implement in order to mitigate the loss of a key input. So this is going to construct the regulatory burden. There are going to be investments that are needed to be made potentially in order to attain the expected levels of production without the key input, and R&D in order to look for alternatives or to research what can work and what cannot work. And after these actions have been taken, there will be an impact on competitiveness potentially, in which the industry in the EEA after this restriction may find themselves in a better place potentially, or maybe not, in which costs might be higher as a consequence of this restriction, or any other impact, and then on exports as a consequence. So with all this, we will have a level of production after the restriction that is going to be producing a given turnover for the sector, for each of the downstream using sectors. And we can measure with that overall economic output for the whole economy and impacts across gross value added in different sectors. So in order to assess all these impacts, first, we're going to construct a baseline scenario. And what is that? A baseline scenario is what would happen without the implementation of this restriction. So the business as usual scenario, or the do nothing scenario. We are going to build this scenario using past historical trends of production in all the different downstream using sectors and in the F-gas industry. And additionally, we're going to ask respondents to our consultation to assess their expectations for the near future. So the minimum requirements of our study include establishing this baseline for employment turnover, measures of costs like OPEX and investments in broad sense, and R&D, and the regulatory burden that is going to be constructed from the expected strategies that firms might develop to mitigate the restriction of F-gases. So any reductions in topic coverage would limit the analysis that can be done and the extent of the credibility of the conclusions that we are going to make. So a baseline scenario, or the do-nothing scenario, represents how your companies would evolve in the absence of the potential restriction of F-gases. And we are going to collect information for that for a baseline current year 2019, and a measure of your expectations of cumulative growth for the next 10 years. So the baseline current year is selected as the 2019 to avoid the years of the pandemic, which are not representative in principle of the longer term trends of the sectors and of your business activities. So we are taking 2019 as the current year, and then we are asking to provide an estimate of cumulative growth in the next 10 years, starting 2022, assuming that 2022 is already a good place to start normality after the pandemic. So we are going to ask about employment expectations in the absence of restrictions to F-gases, against which we would estimate then the net potential effect of the restriction on employment. We are going to ask about turnover expectations without the restriction on F-gases, as well as OPEX. And the relationship between those two is going to be a proxy for the gross value added. This will be a key input for us to calculate macroeconomic extrapolation of impacts from the sample of businesses that are going to be collected to the overall economy. And then we are also going to ask about expectations on investments in the do-nothing scenario, that is in the absence of restrictions, and of R&D expectations to estimate potential net impacts of the potential restriction afterwards. And then regulatory costs that will include operating and capital costs where required due to this restriction as a consequence of the strategies that are expected to be developed, like investigation for alternatives, implementations of such alternatives in the production process, the impacts of those alternatives in cost, energy consumption, etc., which are going to form the broadly defined regulatory costs. So with this baseline scenario as a reference, we're going to ask about the impacts. What are going to be the impacts of a potential restriction of the F-gases in scope? First, we're going to assess the product coverage that is potentially going to be linked to this legislative change. This is key to have internal coherence and an understanding of the scale of impact. So, for instance, not all the products that you produce as downstream users may be equally affected by the legislative change, and not all of them might be affected at all, even without the same broad type of products. So this is where we asked the percentage of products within your portfolio that are going to be affected. Then we are going to characterize how this portfolio of products is going to be affected. For instance, one company may think to seek for a derogation of the restriction of F-gases based on criteria that their product is super important for the functioning of society and cannot be lost its whole production due to the restriction of F-gases. Another strategy can be to look for alternatives to these F-gases that may be more costly or less costly, may work better for the objectives of the F-gas, or may work worse, may have a different product characteristics or performance that make the alternatives not directly equal to the F-gases itself. And in the most extreme case, the consequence from the restriction of F-gases is the loss of production, of some of the production in your portfolio, because you don't have alternatives and there is no other way to keep producing without the F-gases. Then from this step, we are going to move to total regulatory costs that are going to be collected, both the one-off costs and recurring costs, both capital and OPEX costs. And the likely impact on regulatory costs is going to be covered from your responses to previous questions, and you will be asked to assess how much would this cost. The strategies derived from the restriction, how much they cost. And these are going to be explored in detail as a bottom-up gathering of useful evidence for the narrative and with interlinkages across sectors. After this, we are going to be able to construct the specific impacts on operations and sales, turnover and employment. We're going to be able to provide a measure of the overall loss of production and of sales, if any, and using the necessary investments and anticipated product innovation. And finally, we're going to also assess any indirect impacts on sales and other economic impacts. One of them is the ability to modify prices where customers may be able to absorb the increasing costs, that is the pass-through. And we may also include other economic impacts such as R&D, competitiveness, and exports and imports. So as a summary, we are going to have a baseline scenario for all these economic measures from each of the companies and to build an overall measure for each of the downstream using sectors. We are going to assess how the restriction impacts each of these measures in a stepwise manner. And using the baseline and the impacts, we are going to be able to assess a scenario with restriction of all these economic measures. So we are going to have the total regulatory burden affected by the restriction of F-gases, the total investment on R&D affected, how competitiveness is affected, exports affected, turnover, and employment and other economic outputs. So this consultation is going to be done via an online survey. The kickoff is going to be the 4th of April, and it's going to be online for 4 weeks. It's formed of around 50 queries between qualitative and quantitative information. And we're going to target a diverse range of members, such as SMEs, large companies, different downstream using sectors, etc. Anonymity will be preserved thanks to the signature of NDAs, which are going to be signed between you, the participating companies, and us, Ricardo. And CEFIC or the EFCTC will not have access to the data submitted. That is only handled by us. As you know, it's going to be formed by best guesses and expert input, and our questions are going to be defined as mostly as multiple choice questions. We are going to provide ranges where relevant for ease of reference and to guide a little bit the responses. And input from associations will be valuable also in addition to just companies outside of the survey. Associations can respond to our survey, even if just partial information is provided and not the complete survey. And any additional position papers or documentation that they might have on the importance of F-gases to their industry is going to be appreciated and integrated within the larger study. for you as participants in the consultation, this is going to be a multidisciplinary collaboration exercise. It is expected that you have to contact colleagues and teams from across the business to develop these best guesses and expert opinion. You are not expected, a single respondent is not expected to know everything about the business and about the expectations that one may have about the future, both with and without restriction. So consulting colleagues is the way to go. For example, colleagues in the regulatory affairs teams are going to be useful, finance and strategy units, product development and R&D, pricing, etc. Additionally, on top of this, extensive guidance is going to be included in all questions. But in any case, you will be able to contact Ricardo for any additional queries. So as an example of how the questions are going to be, for forming the baseline, we are going to ask along the lines of, for example, in the area of turnover, we are going to ask, what was your annual turnover in total and from the sales of products, mixtures, and/or articles containing the F-gases in scope, both in basic form or in mixtures or blends in the EEA in 2019? This is going to form the current baseline. And to form the future baseline, we are going to ask if the REACH restriction on the manufacture, place on the market and use of the F-gases in scope were not implemented, how would you expect the sales to evolve over the next 10 years, starting on 2022? For finding out the impacts, specifically regulatory impacts and costs, we are going to ask several questions with which we are going to be able to triangulate the information and form a measure of the cost impacts and the business potentially losses. So we are going to ask, for example, if there are viable alternatives to the F-gases in scope or the mixers and blends containing them for use in your products on the market already. We are going to be asking what their performance is compared to the F-gases in scope or of the mixers and blends containing them. And this performance is going to be asked in terms of product performance itself, in terms of cost, in terms of energy consumption, etc. We are going to ask also to identify the percentage of your affected product portfolio in turnover euros that would require substitution and reformulation of F-gases, the removal of F-gas, changes in production, etc. And we are also asking how much would you expect overall capital investment, for example, in the European Economic Area to change on average over the following 10-year period after the implementation of the REACH restriction. So that's more or less about it. The online survey will be launched the 4th of April via an email link. We are going to ask about, after this meeting via form, whether you fall under the downstream using sectors or you are a producer or importer of F-gases directly. If your activities involve REACH registration, you should be on the main questionnaire, but if you are only buying the substances to your production or distribution, you should go to the downstream users. The consultation is going to be live for a period of 4 weeks, so it's going to be closing on the 2nd of May approximately. It's possible to save progress in the survey and to return later, so you'll have plenty of time and opportunities. And a PDF version will be shared with you along the survey link in order for you to have all questions prior to responding. We are going to have this email inbox operative to solve any doubts and queries. And invitations to other industry members that you may be aware of are also appreciated if they haven't been invited. So I think we might open the floor for questions now, Elisa.
Yes, thank you very much, Inge. I just wanted to give a small update regarding the REACH restriction process, because compared to the slide that you have seen, as many of you may know, there has been a delay of 6 months. So see, if you see the scheme on the top still refers to the old timeline. So as you can see, the new expected date for the submission of the dossier is going to be mid-January, specifically 13th of January, 2023. This means that all the other steps are delayed 6 months. Based on this, I would expect the open consultation of ECHA to start, let's say, mid to end of February 2023. So this is when we aim at submitting the radius socioeconomic assessment. Okay, thank you very much. I have a couple of questions in the chat. First of all, yes,